Welcome back everyone to Hearts of Iron 4, and this time we're going to go over a actual update to a mod which is still in beta. This is an update that's kindly being given to me by the mod developers, chiefly Nat, and a few of the other collaborators that he has, and it is the 80 Years War of Resistance. I've already covered this mod in a mod spotlight, but I'm going to mod spotlight update, and I will probably play some of the mod as well on my channel because it is really good. Now, what is very interesting about this mod, you may ask? Well, it is a mod that overhauls, and it's actually been overhauling for a while, but now that Waking the Tiger is out, this is even better because it overhauls East Asia. And so, considering that if you may have been a little bit disappointed, but how, of course, Waking the Tiger expanded upon East Asia, perhaps not enough, you are definitely going to be happy with this mod. If you've already seen my previous video on it, you know why. It adds a very expansive Japanese focus tree that's not too far off from what you would see in a normal Hearts of Iron game. It's more expansive, but it's more something along the lines of what you'd see in Kaiserreich, but it's not as big as some mods make focus trees that are supposed to go in the regular version of Hearts of Iron. So it actually kind of works well within the mechanics of Hearts of Iron, because these focus trees look absolutely gigantic, but they're actually not that difficult to complete because they are mostly like stained compartments. These are all things that are mutually exclusive, so you're not going to be taking all of them. So without further ado, let's quickly go over the main ones. Now, you have already seen a part of the Japan focus tree, which did get expanded upon very greatly in this edition. Remember, this is still in beta, so it's not actually finished. Of course, it's actually adapting some of the Japan focus tree from this regular game, so you can see that the military stuff is the same. You can get those bicycles and bicycle around. This part, the communist part, is basically the same. However, they've also added another ideology to the mod, which is socialism. Not the biggest fan of it, but in Japan it is handy to represent a party called the Shakai Taishuto, which is this one. As you can see from the name of state socialism, they are essentially, in a way, I know it's kind of a meme, but they're kind of like the Nazballs of Japan in 1930. These were people who generally supported the national mobilization state of Japan in the late 30s, which was the whole plan to mobilize the economy and gear it towards war of the ruling government. In fact, of successive ruling governments that succeeded in Japan. And you have a part of the focus tree that's dedicated to that. Still very basic, but it is its own thing. Then you can do a constitutional reform to keep the government strengthened. As you can see, this is the big choice at the beginning of the game. You can either try to placate the military or strengthen the government and try to save Japan's democracy. So in saving Japan's democracy, you can either rebuild the Taisho democracy. I apologize already to any and all Japanese because I will mispronounce everything. The Taisho democracy was the period of, generally in the 1920s, it was the political system of the 1920s. Back when the emperor was not Showa or Hirohito, he was Taisho, who was, I believe, Meiji's son. And Meiji, of course, is the most famous, probably, Japanese emperor, along with Hirohito of the modern age. And under this kind of system, you have a blossoming of liberal politics and constitutional control over the government. However, you also have the seeds of the strife that would actually engulf Japan in the late 30s, early to late 30s, and eventually in the late 30s, you would have the fall of what was remaining of Japan's democracy. Under the rule of, you can see over here, this is the historical path, the Taisei Yokusankai, the Imperial Rule Assistance Society. What's interesting is that if you placate the military, it is historical. You don't immediately start off as fascist. Your ideology is non-aligned, or as it was renamed, reactionary, which represents that if you go down here, you're going to be going through successive cabinets, as you can see. So Konoe's cabinet, then at the beginning you have Kayashi, then at the beginning you have Okada Keisuke, that is representing how many just cabinet changes were happening in Japan in 1936 and 1937. You have like a succession of 4 cabinets, I believe. The reason why they were sort of succeeding each other more and more is because the military did not, if the military did not approve of a cabinet, and more in the late 1930s they did not approve of civilian cabinets for various reasons, the military could simply stall its formation because they had the power to essentially nominate the army and the navy minister. So of course the army minister would be controlled by the army and the navy minister would be controlled by the navy. And if the army or the navy did not approve of the current regime, they could just simply forestall and veto the formation of the cabinet. So that's why you had successive governments that were formed, sometimes due to imperial orders, that eventually were they were all kind of dismantled very, very quickly by the military, and it ended up in what was essentially a military regime by Tojo, which was, of course, this Imperial Rule Assistance Society, which was an attempt at kind of essentially putting together every political force in Japan that was considered legitimate. So at that time, it was very, very reactionary or right-wing, or very, very conservative right-wing, or very nationalist in general forces, put them all together into this massive party that would represent, in theory, everyone. Now, in practice, it was kind of inefficient, but yeah, this is essentially the historical part. The rest, of course, of the part of the democracy route is actually pretty similar to how it works in the standard Hearts of Iron 4 game. The problem is, well, the good thing is that some of these aren't exactly as, quote-unquote, good boy kind of things as you have in the standard Hearts of Iron 4 thing. Once again, what you really need to remember is that this sort of democratic path represents the wishes, essentially, of the expanding Japanese industry. Some of the Japanese industry were behind the extreme right-wing turn of Japan. However, most of them, these zaibatsu, these important ones, were actually supporting more liberal policies because they would be essentially resulting in a more, it's kind of interesting how there's Unit 731, because it would be resulting in a more stable Japan. That's what they wanted to do. So they were still pushing for imperial expansion, just in less aggressive ways. Anyway, if we go further to the left-hand side of the focus tree, there is, of course, the possibility of siding with the Kudo-Ha faction, which does happen historically in 8 Years' War of Resistance, which, by the way, is just the Sino-Japanese War, the way they called it in China. And you do have the possibility of siding with the Kudo-Ha faction. Let's actually switch over to Japan so that you can see it. Essentially, the Kudo-Ha faction were a faction within the military that was representative of more politically reactionary, politically traditionalist forces that wanted a Showa restoration, aka essentially a repeat of what the Meiji restoration was, except not really, because it was to be a turn towards tradition. So an actual restoration of the imperial rule over Japan. Whereas the Meiji Restoration in 1861, it was a restoration in name only, in that it destroyed the shogunate. So you have, as you can see, some very, very complicated modifiers that you can gain in all of these paths, which is always pretty good. And some of these are, of course, more interesting than others. The Kudo-Ha path in particular is pretty interesting because you can also have the new empire thing, which is not part of the imperial way. And essentially you crown a different emperor, and that is kind of nice because you remove your national spirit, Hirohito. So in this way you are kind of trying out a different horse for the emperor, because the emperor might refuse the restoration in the path for the Showa restoration. Of course, if you're trying to give quote-unquote power to the emperor, that is to say to make him your puppet so that you can rule Japan, well, obviously you're gonna need his approval. Now, then of course there's a lot of incentives to be more united with your Asian sort of possessions along this path. And of course, some of them are more towards like a colony, or some of them are more towards like pan-Asianist thought, where you're going to be trying to build a massive Asian alliance. And one of those ways is actually this Hirota Sangen Soku, which would mean like something like the Hirota Principles or something. Hirota is a Japanese politician. See if is he anywhere? Ah, look, it's Kanji Ishibara. He's really cool. Very, very cool figure. Can't really talk about him now. Anyway, there's actually a lot of very, very interesting figureheads and political players around here, and these cabinet ministers that I unfortunately cannot talk about right now. That's a feature that you've already seen, by the way, with the advisors. You've already seen this in my previous spotlight of it, but yeah, you can have advisors from different countries. That is, of course, the case. Yeah, so I can't actually find it, but yeah, he's supposed to be, hold on, maybe he is somewhere over here. No. Anyway, he's a politician of Japan that essentially, quote-unquote, proposed to China, although this is kind of more done to provoke opposition within China. Kind of proposed these quote-unquote principles that were supposedly the conditions that Japan set forth to China for an alliance, and these included various different nefarious ways. They were kind of, in a way, a repeat of the 21 demands of, essentially, during the Great War, Japan set 21 demands upon China for cooperation, quote-unquote, even though they essentially would have made China a puppet of Japan. And this is kind of a repeat for that. Then you also have, of course, Manchuko. Manchuko is pretty much the same as in the standard tree, except it got expanded a lot. So the paths are the same in kind of themes, okay? So you can have obedience or assertiveness and try to declare independence and all that, but they're just very, very heavily expanded, which is great. And another thing that they did, which I really, really like, is they expanded the economy stuff by quite a bit, which kind of gives more credit to how Manchuria was a transforming economic hub for both Japan and China in a way. Because Manchuria, in the 30s and the 20s, had become very, very quickly, thanks in part to Japanese investment, thanks in part to how many interests were going on between earlier on Russia, now the Soviet Union, you know, mainland China's influence, and Japan. They all converged in Manchuria. So what this ended up giving birth to is a great Manchurian economic quote-unquote miracle. Manchuria was developing an industrial society much faster than the rest of China, except for the region of Shanghai out here. So there were true, essentially, modern industrial hubs in China in the 1920s and the 1930s. One of them was Manchuria, so of course Mukden, the main one, modern-day Shenyang. And then there was Shanghai. So that's how important Manchuria was, and most of that came from the Japanese South Manchuria Railway. If we tag over to Manchukuo, I wonder if it's man. It is. If you tag over to Manchukuo, which just means Manchuria, by the way, then you can see that you have the South Manchuria Railway, which was a Japanese-owned railway. Had been preceded by the Chinese Eastern Railway, which ran something like this, and it was an extension of the Trans-Siberian Railway, whereas the South Manchuria Railway ran from essentially here, Xinjiang, all the way down to Liaotung, or Kwantung as the Japanese called it, which is this sort of peninsula, and it was the Japanese concession of Dalian, or Port Arthur. So this conglomerate essentially controlled the Manchurian economy because the railway was the main way after, in 1931, Japan took over Manchuria. It was the main way, well, even before, for Manchurian goods, mostly soybean, rice, and minerals, to reach the international markets because they would be shipped from Port Arthur. Because since the Japanese had influence over Manchuria since essentially the fall of the Qing Empire, well, in fact, no, since the first Sino-Japanese War in 1894, since Japan had very big influence over this area, they would essentially control where Manchuria's goods would be shipped. So that is Manchuria. Then you have the main meat and potatoes, which is China. You can see that there's a lot more warlords. Now, even though the warlord era officially ended with the end of the Northern Expedition in around 1928, you still have some very major parts of the country that are controlled by warlords. Now, if we go to the Republic of China, oh, by the way, yeah, you can see that every one of these countries has a lot of national spirits. So, for example, this military outweighs the government. This is because of the militarism in Japan that essentially controls how the government handles things. Duplicate research efforts is the same as in the vanilla game. You have the Zaibatsu, so that's the same. Doko? The prime minister has a high chance of being assassinated in the case of a reform. Interesting. Sure. State Shintoism and yeah, the inter-service rivalry. I wonder if that's expanded in any way. I wonder if the inter-service rivalry is expanded. Well, I mean, probably not yet because, I mean, you can influence. Oh, so it's also using decisions. That's great. I had not seen that before. Okay, this is basically the same. Good. So let's tag back to China, who has, if you recall, this is basically the same as in the first time I checked out the mod. They've got some very, very nasty modifiers, especially this illiterate population. This is Wen. And then unbalanced industry, incompetent heavy industry. It's just like, and then you have Jiang's dictatorship, which does give you some political modifiers. Disjointed government, appeasement policy, essentially because Jiang Jieshi, this guy, Chiang Kai-shek, his policy was that he would try to appease Japan as much as possible, which is why he let them take over Manchuria in 1931, despite the fact that there was a 200,000 strong warlord, who we will see soon, Zhang Xueliang, in Manchuria. This was part of China until 1931, so 5 years before the events of, well, four and a little bit before the events of Hearts of Iron 4, because he wanted to win the war, the civil war against Mao Zedong's, well, at the time it wasn't Mao Zedong's, but against the Communist Party. So you of course have that in the focus tree for China, you're going to have to deal with essentially your priorities. Are you going to go after the communists, which open up some paths to align with Japan, because you can recognize Japan's the principles or whatever and be friends with them. That can also lead to the rise of Wang Jingwei, who was essentially the collaborator for Imperial Japan in the Sino-Japanese War. And you can do your own coup, blah 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 blah. That essentially makes you fascist, the collaborationists, or you can just be a collaborationist Kuomintang, or collaborationist nationalist party under Jiang. And with that, you can either again do that or try to just unite China, but on its own, and that gives you also that the option to give Japan a nice chunk of territory so that you can just get some time. And then, yeah, you don't have any problems, technically. You can also get some extra Navy stuff from Japan. By the way, the whole, foreign support thing has been kind of abolished for China. Although I believe the warlords have some Anyway, so what you end up having is that you either go down that route or go down the historical route and get a truce on the Chinese Civil War. There's a few options over there. Most of them have to deal with somehow prosecuting the war against Japan. And then some of them have to do with how you deal with the warlords and get themselves, in on the club, in on the anti-Japan United Front. And then you have your whole political stuff. Now, in the political stuff, you can either really full-on accept a compromise with the socialists and try to be their little buddy. You can either become essentially a socialist with John Lan, much like you can with Hearts of Iron 4's PRC, or you can have Xinjiang Doctrine and then essentially become the Chinese Republic. Then you have the whole historical path, full-on historical, which would be either reinforce the New Life movement or the New Culture movement. Now, the New Culture movement is essentially what the initial Chinese revolutionaries tried to promote, essentially fighting against the old, outdated culture, which included Confucianism. It included the narrow-minded spirit of old China, mostly again fighting that kind of thing to create a new Chinese modern culture, striving for science, striving for modern values and all of that, trying to bring China into the modern world. And that was essentially the New Culture movement, the 新文化运动 in Chinese. And it was replaced in real life by the New Life movement, or the 新活动. And this is what Jiang Jieshi essentially promoted, because he was much more politically conservative than the initial Chinese revolutionaries, who included not just Sun Yat-sen, the most famous one, or Sun Yat-sen as he's known, but also included some of the leading figures that would then essentially jumpstart the Communist Party, like Chen Duxiu and various intellectuals. Of course, Jiang Jieshi being much more politically conservative, he tried to essentially revive Confucianism in a more modern way, and this New Life movement was essentially a rekindling of Chinese traditional culture. Once again, a little bit more adapted to the modern world, but still much more traditional in outlook. And from there, you get more authoritarian options. You can either essentially have the one-party tutelage, which was a system under which essentially the KMT, or the Nationalist Party, was the quote-unquote tutor of Chinese democracy, not allowing a full-on democratic system to emerge because the Chinese society was not ready yet to make that kind of transformation to a democratic base. So this is the more historical route. You can have two options: either the sort of fully historical route, the Yidan Zhiguo, one-party country. So yeah, essentially one party stays, and that's the historical thing, quote-unquote, trying to keep the Kuomintang in power and Chiang Kai-shek's policies in check. Or you can have the blue shirt crew, which is essentially you become fascist. Now, within the Republic of China in the 1920s, there was, some would call this regime fascist. It is represented in game as non-aligned, but many did call this kind of regime fascist, except not as efficient as the fascist regimes of the West. In fact, Jiang Jieshi himself did praise fascism in his speeches and all of that, said that it was kind of the way forward, quote-unquote, for China. And so there were actually a lot of internal factions within the Nationalist Party, which was a very, very divided, very, very factionalistic party. There were factions in there that supported the left wing and the communists, and then there were factions in there that supported full-on fascism. This was the Citron Clique and the blue shirts, so either the CC and the blue shirts. Of course, the CC is the less famous one in a way, but the blue shirts were really famously quote-unquote fascist, and they were essentially a group of military figures. So you can either support them or the Central Club, and the Central Club more goes down to the historical path. Then you can either revive the new culture movement and try to go ahead and establish democracy for China. You have the three principles of the people, famous ones, famous political doctrine of Sun Yat-sen, and they're, well, here they're translated in an interesting way. I've never seen them translated this way. Ethnicism, democratism, and civilianism. Usually these are translated as nationalism, democracy, and either socialism or welfare. I believe it was translated in Hearts of Iron 4 Vanilla. Ethnicism or nationalism or whatever you want to call it, minzujui, which, now that I think about it, yeah, it does mean ethnicism, more like literally. Essentially, China in all of its ethnicities, because the way China's nationalism works is that essentially China is this big whole container of different ethnicities. More than like 50, I believe, are recognized today by the Chinese government. And of course, the majority are Han Chinese, but all of these ethnicities make up China as a whole, as a sort of national concept rather than an ethnic one. But yeah, that's the concept of ethnicism. Essentially, all these, they called them races back in the day in the translations. All these races need to unite together and bring about a new China, so that China's more united and outward-looking rather than fighting among itself. Democratism or democracy, self-explanatory, the people's rule. Or some people also just translate it as the people's rule because they say that it's not like the democratism translation would be a little bit more confusable with the Western system, whereas supposedly something else was meant. Blah, 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 blah. Don't care about it right now. That's a discussion for another day. And then civilianism or welfare or socialism, as it is sometimes translated, is essentially the people's welfare, right? So new outlooks on life, new healthcare, new science, new just a new state that can really provide for the citizen. And then in the middle you have a foreign assistance stuff, which is what you'd expect. You either get support from the Allies, the Comintern, or the Axis, which, to be fair, does make quite a bit of sense given how Hearts of Iron 4 works. Although I would kind of like this a little bit expanded with how the big expansion was for the Hearts of Iron 4 vanilla Chinese focus tree. And then you just go down there and you can either become isolationist, join a faction, found a faction, and then deal with the border disputes in Tibet, the Raj, and Mongolia. All in various different ways. The whole army stuff is mostly the same, except it's actually a lot more expanded in some ways, especially because with the whole industry stuff, with the way it is connected to the whole industry stuff, because you have all these modifiers to your industry that you're going to have to get rid of by essentially getting all of these industrial focuses done. And the industrial focuses are prerequisited by some technology. So essentially, the more you advance when it comes to your technology, the more you're going to be able to do these centralizations. And if you do these nationalizations and centralizations, then you can essentially get rid of your modifiers and then have some very, very nasty amounts of factories. And get rid of your bad modifiers as well. I've already said that. You can also get some good, of course, good resources, very, very good resources, in fact. And yeah, so if Japan lets you get to the late game, you're going to be very strong, or vice versa. If, as Japan, you let China get to the late game, even the AI is going to be very, 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 very capable of putting up a fight. Then you can have some monetary reforms, which lead down to the whole technology stuff. Monetary reforms are needed because at the start China has a silver standard economy, which is the traditional way which China sort of balanced out its currency. China only in around the late 1890s introduced a national currency, and its standard was with silver, as was traditional. But essentially, the whole price of silver was steadily increasing because of that, and silver was slowly but surely being siphoned off from China. So this is why this is a problem. Then you have a lot of different new designers and theorists, which is welcome. And then you have, of course, your own political figures. Some of them quite famous, some of them less, but most of them quite interesting. Actually, they don't have their own little descriptions, which is kind of annoying. Of course, most famous probably is, or rather are, So Mei-ling and H.H. Kung. These are probably the two most famous out of all of these, but you do have quite a lot of them. And you have some internal problems, as I already said. Now, you have a lot more warlords. Some of these you never saw. That is because if you go to look at the subjects tab, the Northeastern Army and Shandong, which is this, Shandong is this province under Han Fuju, they're integrated puppets, and in normal Hearts of Iron, they'd just be part of the KMT. That's because they're very, very closely sort of under Zhang. And then this guy is the Northeastern Army. Again, I said Northwestern because geographically they're northwest. But if you remember, Zhang Xueliang, this guy has been exiled out of Manchuria, and they're called the Northeastern Army because these are the remnants of his forces. And he's close to the communists, and he can jumpstart the CN incident. Essentially, well, I mean, you've probably read about it, but yeah, he can do that. The Chinese Soviet Republic, we'll check them out for last. Then you have the Citron Clique, which in Hearts of Iron 4 would also be part of the Republic of China. That is essentially because the Citron Clique, like here it's represented as one clique or alliance of warlords under Liu Xiang, but in real life it was very, very fragmented, so often it is just dumped in together with the whole central government. They are, all of these warlords have the standard warlord focus tree, so nothing too particularly strange, except Xinjiang, which we'll check out later. Then you have, of course, the Yunnan Clique. Actually, wow, Kunming, 10 VPs, damn. The Yunnan Clique under Long Yun. I wonder if these warlords have their own, like, advisors or whatever. Zhao Qin, robber baron. What an interesting person. Peng Dejiang. Oh, damn. Now, these look pretty generic, but oh well, that's okay. That's okay for them. Yeah, there's new advisors as well, which is kind of funny. The new Guanxi clique, the Guanxi clique has been split. So you normally are used to seeing the Guanxi clique down here being united under this guy, Li Zongren. In real life, it was more like an alliance between the new Guanxi clique, there was an old one as well, under Li Zongren, and the Guangdong clique under Chen Jitang. And the eastern one was the one that later joined up with the Republic of China and betrayed the new Guanxi clique. That is because these are named like that because this is there's actually more states. They've actually changed around all the states. That's kind of cool. Because this area is Guangxi province, whereas this area is Guangdong province. So, yeah. Then you have Xikang under Liu Wenhui, who would later join the communists, and just let them march through his province in the Long March, just like Yunnan did, kind of pissing off Jiang Jieshi, because the Chinese Soviet Republic, which we'll get to later, used to be over here in Jiangxi, which is this part. Then they, of course, marched across in the Long March and eventually reached up here. Then you have Tibet, just doing their own thing. There's no more Xibei Sanma, Xibei Sanma being the northeastern free Ma's. There's 3 of them, and they are Ma Hushan in Tunganistan, there's Ma Bufang in Qinghai, and there is Ma Honghui in Ningxia. Now, hold on, which was the leader in... yeah, I believe the leader is supposed to be Ma Bufang in Vanilla Hearts of Iron 4, but still, these are the northwestern warlords of the Ma clique. This is actually kind of more a kind of more of an ethnic revolt in a way. Tunganistan, Tungans is another way to say Chinese Muslims, and they are up against Shanshatsai's Xinjiang faction, and these have a new focus tree that is supposed to represent how they were buddy-buddies with the Soviet Union, or they can also try to get more on the good side of China and just be up with them, or you can even try to be an independent Xinjiang in you know, as many ways as possible. And there's also a little tiny thing, the Kumul, which is kind of funny. Yeah, there was actually another rebellion over here, which was supported by the Ma's, and it tried to kind of create this own ethnic state out here. It was just kind of another one of those ethnic rebellions, because this area of China is one of the more ethnically diverse, this whole area in general. So yeah, that's kind of interesting in that way. Then you go up ahead and around, and you find the more Japanese-aligned warlords. So the Pailing Miao Council, who will become, unless Republican China does this focus, split the Pailing Miao Council. Unless they do that, this, you may recognize this guy. This is the leader of Menguko. So he's going to become a Mongolian separatist under, you know, Japan's influence. Fighting against the Chinese government. Then you have the East Chahar Autonomous Region under Li Shouxin, and these guys had been split off from China way back when, in you know, in the years between 1932 and 1936. And you have the Hebei Chahar Political Council, which was kind of like a no man's land in between Republic of China and Japan. And over the political situation of this political council will be essentially the whole pretext for the Second Sino-Japanese War. And then you have, of course, the other Hebei little political entity, the East Hebei Autonomous Council. Again, these are all called very similar, and they're very confusing, but these are another Japanese puppet. And then you have the model governor, Yan Shishan, under the Shanxi Clique. And that's basically just, you know, normal Shanxi Clique. Although I believe in, yeah, I believe in regular Hearts of Iron 4. For some reason, he controls Sui Yuan, which I never really quite understood. He controls like this area, which is kind of ahistorical. He just controlled Shanxi province, which is this one, and then nearby Sha'anxi, or whatever you want to call this, is controlled by the Soviets. At the start, the Chinese Soviet Republic, they have to deal with a lot of problems, as you may know. And did I forget anyone? Did I forget about anyone? I don't think I did. Yeah, no. Is there anything new from Mongolia? Oh, yeah, there is a Mongolian focus tree. Okay, well, that's good. Oh wow, even Russian diaspora. Look at that, white officers. That's awesome. White Mongol. Oh, New Sternberg. Yeah, man. Anyway, Tenutuva? Ah, okay. That would have been too awesome. There's also, of course, the Indo-Chinese Union with their own little thing. Oh, wow. You can even become a fascist Indonesia. Sure. That's kind of interesting. I wonder if you can become the Viet Minh. And there's also, of course, Federated Malaya. So it's just a Asia overhaul, but wait, it's Siam? No, okay, Siam doesn't have a focus tree. That's okay. Dutch East Indies? I don't know. Nah, okay. Philippines? Right, that was, sorry for that. I just wanted to check out everything. So there's actually a little bit more of an overhaul than just China and Japan. Actually didn't see that the Mongolian Focus Republic had a focus tree. So you can either stay with the USSR, try to throw your your die with Mao or whatever, or have a pan-Mongolist coup, which pan-Mongolianism or pan-Mongolism was quite a thing actually back in the day, partially due to the events of the Russian Civil War, and and partially due to the events of the Sino-Japanese War as well. Experience of revolutions. Okay. There's actually some very, very cool art in here as well. And yeah, again, you can have the whole White Mongolia, which is fucking hilarious. And you become the traditionalist White Mongolians. Anyway, that tangent aside. Oh, and by the way, you can become Mongolia also with the Piling Miao Council. Once Menguko spawns, they have a focus tree. And another person that can have its own focus tree and essentially become another thing is the Hebei Chahar Political Council. If the Chinese essentially collaborate with Japan a little bit too much, they are going to become one Jinwei and its own collaborationist regime with, I believe, a unique focus tree, although I'm not sure. It might not be finished. So in the end, we get to Mao and the Chinese Soviet Republic. They are a fragmented government. They essentially are blocked in. They don't have a supply route, essentially, to the Soviet Union. So that is a blessing in disguise because they don't really have to deal with Soviet influence as much right now. But in the focus tree, there are things that happen due to that. So there's also a mechanic for the long march, how much you're going to be recovered from the long march. And to do that, you need to go down this Chinese workers and peasants Red Army, getting some of these, oh wow, interesting, getting some of these techs done and some of these focuses done. Then you can do your 5-year plan. It's a very, very expansive economy focus tree, which is very, very cool. And in the War of Liberation stuff and the military stuff, there's also some good things that make use of that whole like infiltration mechanic that they had in Waking the Tiger that they added. So it's kind of nice. If the Soviets like historically occupy Manchuria and northeastern China, you can demand it from them, which is kind of nice and historical. And you can come down here and get yourself some political stuff done. Now, there's a lot of it on how you're going to be dealing with your neighboring warlords, either trying to go west and fighting the Ningxia Ma clique and then the Qinghai Ma clique, so trying to expand your influence westward, or going east, starting a war with the Shanxi clique, and then trying to essentially present yourself as an anti-Japanese force. In that way, you're going to have a way to contact Zhang Xueliang and trying to essentially instigate the whole Xi'an incident. Or you can try to be even more anti-Japanese and just say resist the nationalists and oust the imperialists. So fight both. And oh, this will give the enemy debuffs. Love that focus. Vandalism. This will give the enemy debuffs. Sure. So there's a lot of ways that you can go about fighting Japan. This is the main way. Then you of course have your own little political focus tree. Can I say you're going to be more open to the Soviets and trying to get Zhang Guotao into place. And that of course is going to be trying to, a war will be declared on the Ningxia Ma clique, these guys over here, because you need to open up your route to the Soviets so that they can supply you. And that actually can also lead with fascism, which is like, okay, it's interesting. Then you have the Chinese Communist Party first, historical route, quote unquote, socialism with Chinese characteristics, although that's kind of more of a modern phrase from the 1970s, late 1970s. That was after Mao, but yeah, whatever. And then you have expanding the United Front, trying to be more leaning towards what, funnily enough, this is more towards the Comintern as well, because the Comintern wished the United Front to be more stable, so that it would be an anti-Japanese balance act. And yeah, that's pretty okay for that. Or you can rethink Trotskyism, because why the hell not? And in this, you're gonna get Pan Shutz as a leader. I have no idea who he is, so yeah, you can have some different leaders. The two center ones keep Mao Zedong in power, and then you can have a sort of debate over the political form of your country. You can either be essentially the Chinese People's Republic down here, the People's Republic of China, so that's historical, a military dictatorship, the New Nationalists, the Soviet Republic of China, and you know, keep yourself as the Chinese Soviet Republic and establish a new nation. or a federal republic, the Federal Republic of China. So that's more in line with Trotskyism kind of stuff. Really now, public elections will be held. Well, that doesn't seem like such a good idea now, does it? Then you can either say be at peace, you know, in the reunification, be at peace with you know, your enemies, and then that is actually liberation of Siberia. Under the influence of the evil Stalinism, the Soviet Union is no longer a socialist companion, and they have to withdraw from Asia. Well, that's pretty interesting. So you can also fight the Soviets. You can join the Soviets in the Comintern, make your own little Chinese faction, or say reunification and gain annex war goals against all independent warlords, whereas this one would just be peace negotiations. And once you've done that, then you can go down the economy path, because at the beginning, the 5-year plan, you can't do that because you're not, you know, you're not this, you're just this, or you might be this. So yeah, is that about it? I think it is. Now, I have 2 ideas for who to play, and they're radically different. One of them is the Chinese Soviets, and the other one is Japan. So if you guys want to see this mod turn into kind of a series, it is going to come at a little bit of a later date, because right now, if you know, if you've been following on my channel, you've probably seen that I'm pretty you know, kind of stoked about the new Kaiserreich update, so I'm very, very much pushing that along. But in the future, I am going to play some more you know, different mods for Hearts of Iron, and this one is definitely my first one on the list. So if you guys want, I could play this one, and those are like my 2 main choices. So I guess you can, you know, shoot away in the comments and tell me why you'd like one or the other, and just, you know, support one or the other. Or even if you have other ideas, just go ahead and shoot them. So I want to thank y'all for watching. I hope that you've enjoyed, and I will see you soon, hopefully.